2016 was an interesting year as it remains the one where my last video before this very one was related to another huge hit from Marvel being the highest grossing film of that very year. But for the tail end, there was something that came really close to it and off of a high year where a beloved franchise was coming back fresh off of the shelf. Or of course I'm talking about Star Wars, where the previous year was The Force Awakens, coming 10 years after The Revenge of the Sith, which now speaking in terms of The Force Awakens is also 10 years old now, crazily enough. Where speaking of that, I also found my next video idea alongside scripting this one, where the one I'm talking about today relates to what now became regarded as a modern Star Wars classic known as Rogue One. I know technically from this video's release that next year will be 10 years for that film, but considering what released earlier, I think it's now time to go back and praise what good this film really did in a more divided world in all senses of that term, and mostly Star Wars fans of course. For going back to such a year was a real positive in terms of both the MCU and Lucasfilm compared to what would be the state of it 10 years later. And looking back on it specifically, I don't think what has happened was a complete disaster. You could save the entire stupidity of the death of its franchise for the sensationalist channels that made it so on the internet with no weights whatsoever, and other than the fact that we can agree that the sequels are trash and wasted potential. But a general consensus that has emerged from all of Disney's Star Wars up to this point is that Rogue One is the best movie that they have ever done, focusing on a ragtag group of rebels trying to steal the Death Star plans, basically just the plot of the opening crawl of A New Hope to how events came to be, where it's been even more straightened recently as a modern Star Wars classic with shows like Andor that focused on Cassian before the events of the film, expanding upon the history of rebellions and the tyranny of empires, showcasing a level Star Wars had not seen before and praised for being so. Where if you consider this time since December is when they released it, and now roughly only coming months off the ending of Andor overall, you find it being a much more interesting to revisit such a movie that introduced its characters and then killed them off at the very end. The main heroes, the main villain, except for the ones we knew the most going into that saga, elevated to a level that was never seen before and put the worst fears to realization. Rogue One contains the elements of what you would call a bridge movie, considering the events and people are connected to the prequels themselves, like Clone Wars character Saw Gerrera, Bail Organa from the prequels, and then of course connecting it straight through to the original saga, like literally showcasing that the ending takes roughly before the start of A New Hope, or as we all know, Star Wars 1977. That the main point of this film was not of just showing how events led up to the first Star Wars film, but of the people and places that it took to get there. The struggle of a society as a whole to rise up against oppressive forces as seen when you take Andor to a larger context of who exactly the Galactic Empire is and what the rebellion stands for. Taking a step further to show us a Star Wars without the main Jedi versus Sith, the mythology, and all the other Force users that are usually involved in the context of Star Wars. The difference of course in these films is that Rogue One still had Darth Vader and the Guardians of the Whills, while Andor hinted to, but majority stayed away and focused on the political nature and battles that regular people fight. So basically it's the reality away from the main characters who literally are the strongest of the bunch, facing directly with those like Vader or Palpatine, while this is the smaller background of what actually goes on. A first step into a larger world in the sense of the common man, or alien, where this story's hero happens to be Jyn Erso, and maybe Andor to an extent, but then again he had a whole series where it's more about her family, with Galen Erso being the primary designer of the Death Star, and the one who designed the biggest flaw to be exploited, with the main villain being Director Orson Krennic, in charge of military weapons research and the man who claims the Death Star as his own prize tool, eventually clashing with the likes of familiar faces we all knew as Grand Moff Tarkin. Where this film did something interesting that has become more commonplace to a degree in the CGI recreations of deceased or older actors, with Peter Cushing's face on another actor, an interesting era that started out for Disney with Clue for Tron Legacy to de-age Jeff Bridges, and now more used in Star Wars to get back to the original trilogy era. The idea of the irreplaceable images of characters that have been debated for good or bad reasons for the past few decades. Or besides that, this film still continued those great advancements and use of technology from the sequel era, where practical effects were combined with advanced CGI techniques to create worlds we never thought was possible, which unfortunately is all I'm going to say on that half, because the main focus is still on the storytelling of this film and why it's so perfect. And we are just going to highlight the great journey that they went through, from young Jyn Erso up to her death to save the rebellion. And going back to this time, one of the interesting things that these films did is that it's labeled as a Star Wars story, where there is no opening crawl and it just begins in space. And the reason it ended up being like that was for the fact that it was going to have a crawl, but changed as it realized it wasn't pertaining to the Skywalker saga itself. It was its own separate Star Wars story where you can make it take place in a galaxy far, far away, and not like a saga or serial that those opening crawls were once inspired by. It was a different time before, of course, the rise of Disney Plus and other streaming services, with Disney having full competence to release a Star Wars film about every year, even though that didn't turn out the way they expected and they take a step back from doing such things. But besides that, we have Krennic landing on the planet of Lamu, where the Ursos were hiding from him, taking him in because the Death Star wasn't going anywhere, as Urso was an expert in kyber crystals or technology requiring empowering the station. This information comes years after being friends up to the early days of the Empire from the collapse of the Republic, where they did not know what they were working to build until the events of the film where he becomes a farmer, knowing what Krennic would do because of their evil. And Andor was perfect in representing the evil that those like Krennic actually brought to the table, and why people like Galen Erso decided to retire and live on a farm far away from ever being involved with the tyrannical empire.
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close to providing peace, security for the galaxy.
You're confusing peace with terror.
Well, you have to start somewhere.
But going against such an empire leads to futile actions, leading to Lyra Urso's death as they made Jyn run away from them, where she would eventually be found by Saw Gerrera and start events off to this certain point. On the other hand, we skip years later, and something that takes place after the finale of Andor, where Cassian traveled to the rings of Kafrin to meet with Tivik, who had important information to validate what Luthen Rael learned about that Clea passed on to Cassian. And if you think upon events that happened in the final season, you see how this film is a desperate rush by the rebellion to find out what the Empire was building. This is being the very moment that such a weapon existed, and it was validated by previous information that was hidden from the public to subjugate the galaxy in terror. But the other information that was a part of it was the fact that Galen sent an Imperial cargo pilot that defected to relay what could have been info to stop the weapon to Jeddah to meet with Saw Gerrera, where this movie shows us the partisans, the rebel group who are more akin to terrorists or extremists by their own aggressive actions. Like, because the rebellion is a smaller group fighting an entire empire, there are notable factions that this movie introduced in order to show how hard it is to bring it to an end. The definitions people have of fighting tyranny by whatever means possible that causes more harm than good in some cases. And over this information, they managed to find out and capture Jyn Erso, who was imprisoned and on the run, where the info relating to Galen required her help to actually find him, namely getting the pilot from Saw's grasp on Jeddah, as they have a history as shown in the beginning of the film. Another key aspect of the rebellion having those factions is those like General Draven, who of course is aligned with the greater alliance as a whole, but as a military officer has his own opinions on how to deal with things, like seeing people as Galen as an opportunist and not really an ally at all, being part of that faction that is connected more with Saw Gerrera than actual people who want to restore the Republic, who secretly orders Cassian to kill him behind Jyn's back, because there are people who would do whatever is necessary again. Where even though we know that this is the good guys, there are always going to be bad sides of every good person. Where speaking on behalf of bad people, we show us Krennic's first appearance with Tarkin, who heard about this breach on Jeddah and demands that Krennic solve this problem as delays of the Death Star grew far too great for the Emperor's patience, and a rebellion that has grown to a full point. It's a stark contrast of power where you see the leaders of the Empire and their own bickering on getting things done, as contrasted to his dominant role as seen in the beginning, or even in Andor when dealing with ISB agents like Dedra Meero for her incompetence. Like, going back to the series itself, you see this interesting structure they built up and how heads are cut off if they see something wrong. No limit to the abusive and aggressive powers that care only for themselves or who is in line with the Sith Lord who rules them all. So having Tarkin here after events like Andor, and eventually as we see Darth Vader, shows us the lineage of power in the Empire that is both corrupt and ordered from the greatest to the least, and in comparison to Andor with the ISB, where Krennic is the one in trouble here compared to him being a huge figure towering over these others. And then when you get to Jeddah, you see Jyn's uneasiness involved with these people like the partisans who've been attacking the Imperial strongholds, and of course being tasked with the rebellion, since that lifestyle brought her more harm than good. And then how you go and move to introduce other characters like the Guardians of the Wheels, with those like Chirrut who could sense her kyber crystal necklace. It shows us in an interesting way in the world of Star Wars that there are people connected to the Force, but not a full-on Force user who is more blind and travels with his fellow Guardian, Baze Malbus, who showcases their skills with just the staff. because that's what you do when you have someone like Donnie Yen playing the role. It's a factor of the difference of the types of people who have their own skills to fight empires or preserve the older Jedi ideals, just like the difference of having the partisans who fight rough and capture them to meet Saw Gerrera, actually meeting the pilot in this way being Bodhi Rook. And the events of this movie put into perspective the state of Saw Gerrera's mind as leader of the partisans, very conspiratorial and crazy as a rebel mirror image to Darth Vader, using things like a breathing apparatus and mechanical legs, as being contrasted when people first saw him in the Clone Wars, where this appearance shows you someone who has been far gone down the years of the Empire, and even more so when you discover in the series he likes huffing down Rhydonium, a man fallen from grace since his sister died sadly, or at the very least he still valued people like Jyn and fighting for what they had to do, where he left her behind because people were starting to get suspicious, and had to do anything necessary with his mind and logic to keep her safe, because he still did love her.
Not a day goes by that I don't think of you.
That what we see within the context of all the series and just the movie itself, Saw is not really an evil or bad person. Yes, he does plenty of bad things within the context of his character, but that's not who he is and who he's fought for. He's just a lost soul who's put everything into this fight for the Empire, and even he admits the state of himself when he got a hold on Galen's message to pass on to Jyn, to remind her of what she could be doing in the face of adversity when she did not want to fight at all for the love of Stardust, which as we learn was also the name of the project that showed the weak spot within the Death Star, the same weapon at this point who was actually looming over the city of Jeddah with Krennic and Tarkin gathering to finally test it by putting a blast on the city and not the whole moon because plot armor and of course, you know, making a statement. And this scene is a good contrast between Tarkin and Krennic, who yells fire immediately to get it over with as somebody who values this project as his own achievement, and Tarkin who takes over amicably, who, you know, gains more power through the shadows. And it also puts into perspective the true destructive potential of the Death Star. I mean, sure, you do get a whole planet blown up in the first film, and that's really scary on its own because of its huge power, but when you look back on this film and seeing the effects that have been enhanced here, destroying only an area of a planet or a moon, that is just as equally as destructive that puts into scale the Death Star's power. Like, we could see a huge chunk of it all go missing into space, where then you have several shots of it looming like an eclipse or an actual massive structure that the original wasn't just capable of yet by their technology, showcasing the real fear that George was going with for the Empire and these weapons that this film creates, where it does create a straightened emotional value to why they had to fight, who they were, and what that was used for, where this also pertains to the same time that her whole world was crumbling, seeing a message from her father, and of course Saw's resignation to end his fight right here after so many years. I could say I was originally disappointed and surprised to see him go like that, knowing his character from Clone Wars, but seeing him from that point and in Rebels and finally Andor, and especially Andor considering his speech knowing it was his time to go, I think it was really a perfect decision.
Save the rebellion! Save the dream!
Knowing that she can carry it forward, that her father's wish was to have her continue to fight, carrying information with Bodhi that this is the Death Star and that they found a way to destroy it. That his sacrifice in the scene when the Death Star blew up Jeddah is an admittance that Jyn is the future, that she holds the path forward to stopping the Death Star and of course the Empire as a whole. And she sees it herself, doing a 180 from her original viewpoint, but now with the conviction that something must be done. The same kind of path that Andor was on in his whole series, and so many others when you realize what it actually costs, what these people do, and the need to help. This brings up the Edu portion of the film, the moment where both sides first clash when Krennic flies over to see what Galen was doing, or his scientists as they try to rescue him or secretly kill him as orders suggested when the rebels engaged upon the facility, which sadly we know was the scene that resulted in his death, but not before a last glimpse at his Stardust, his daughter, to remind him what needs to be done, just like Saw earlier, where she has to be the one to do it. Galen was never going to come out of this film as a survivor, and of course neither was Saw, as that trend shows that people will die, something that actually started out with Luthen's sacrifice, where if your name is not Luke Skywalker, whoever runs directly within the Death Star or indirectly involved with its plans, you can guarantee your life will be ended. That this is just the cost of being outnumbered by a massive enemy, but for a good cause that you know will ring true in the end. Of course, because of this attack, she and everyone accuses and knows that Cassian had orders to kill him, but how he said he chose not to, thinking he just obeys the orders like a stormtrooper, but knowing he disobeyed them like he did so many times because of what he's seen, who he had to sacrifice to get to this point in his life, where Jin is simply on a path like Andor into what he went through, just on a faster scale where the weapon is ready to fire.
Suddenly the rebellion is real for you. Some of us live it. I've been in this fight since I was 6 years old. You're not the only one who lost everything. Some of us just decided to do something about it.
You can't talk your way around this.
I don't have to.
Like, you see with this quote, she simply thinks he's deflecting from his story, but his real story is just very complicated and heartbreaking, trying to not be a part of the dangers he went through, but in the end, he's sacrificing more for it because it was just the right thing to do. And sometimes, the hard deaths would just come no matter what happens, and Jin now has to live with that fact, just as he's done. And after this incident, is where we see Krennic travel to Mustafar, to Vader's castle with the very place that Obi-Wan cut him down, whereas his presence is as opposing as ever, fueled by the dark side and standing way above Krennic with his height and voice, once again done by James Earl Jones before he passed years later. Like Tarkin before, it elevates the story's presence into the shadow of the main figures of the Empire or of the Rebellion, the dark truth behind it all, where even Imperials fear who this man is, and the continued cover-up that the Death Star doesn't exist, where now he's tasked with trying to find what Galen did to the Death Star before telling him not to choke on his aspirations of power. The classic Anakin one-liners that are still present in the Darth Vader personality. They then switch back to the gathering of the rebels debating on this horrific information with the same ones who were skeptical in Andor's finale about the Death Star plans from Bluton, where they secretly have funded the rebellion. From their perspective, they were just senators who were just backing these causes from the political perspectives they knew best and not the underground ones that never learned or could imagine the scale beneath their feet of what the Empire was really doing, like what they did here. They feel on their side this is going to be suicidal to their cause against others. The Empire is just vast and wide, containing their own planets, and they have a limited pool of resources, while Jin on the other hand tries to express the urgency of what they have done and what they themselves have been doing, like those like Cassian who's done it their whole lives.
Run! Hide! Plead for mercy! Scatter your forces! You give way to an enemy this evil with this much power, and you condemn the galaxy to an eternity of submission. The time to fight is now!
Yes.
Every moment you waste is another step closer to the ashes of Jeddah!
Yet how the others just simply could not see that if their names are not Mon Mothma or Bail Organa. They simply could not see that side and give up. Hence why this only works for those who actually fought the Empire close up, with Andor sticking up for her and joining her, alongside those like Melshi, who Saul had a history before and became a fellow fighter, where he believes her because he's already been there. He's been to the point where he's done and see the worst things that both sides have done.
We've all done terrible things on behalf of the rebellion. Spies, saboteurs, assassins. Everything I did for the rebellion. And every time I walked away from something I wanted to forget, I told myself it was for a cause that I believed in, a cause that was worth it. Without that, we're lost. Everything we've done would have been for nothing. I couldn't face myself if I gave up now. None of us could.
His speech represented everything that he went through in such a perfect series and what everything about this movie stands for. Because you have to make something count. It's about everyone you love doing it for the better, to put yourself behind something greater as we look back on everything we've done now. Yet even though we had series like Andor give us this greater context to look back on, those feelings were certainly present from the start when this movie came out itself. Its environment was already built and directed to feel that way, and why it should be regarded as the best, even with or without the series, as they all fight to reach the end. I also realize now that I have almost forgot K2SO for the most part. The Imperial droid played by Alan Tudyk, who we all know now as Disney's Lucky Charm, appearing in every animated movie since Wreck-It Ralph, where his role blends the seriousness of a droid but the comedy needed in those situations as what rebellions need to fight an empire, reprogrammed as we see their devastating effects in the KX series for something to fight. At the same time, we see how Mon Mothma and Organa knows how inevitable the situation is, the war that's about to come, setting events beforehand that led to his demise, while also putting the seeds of a new hope, sending Leia to get Obi-Wan, where the war has just begun as we see them reach Scarif, with the Force guiding them to make it through the shield gate. And something like scenes like that, showcasing how she grasped to her Kyber crystal, reminds you just of how difficult it was for them to even succeed, where just using this one random Imperial shuttle does not really guarantee a safe landing to commence an operation, as again we see at the end, all of them die no matter what happens. Like, the entire message and the reason why the original Star Wars is titled the way it is now is because rebellion is built on hope, that even if we are outmatched, the will of a few can match the will of 1,000, similar to Cassian's quote here.
Make 10 men feel like 100.
And that has to be my favorite quote because it represents how you can make a force as small as they are feel like a legit army, as it would be known as the Battle of Scarif, the first major conflict in what would be known as the Galactic Civil War. Because before this point, you have to keep in mind they fought through various cells or proxies. Usually the Empire just puts down protester movements so easily, and they can only do it through small scale attacks to get information like we've seen in Rebels. But this one turned the tide for something greater, beginning as an infiltration. Well, of course, they set explosives around the perimeter until they had a way to find to get the plans. On the other side, you do have a desperate Krennic trying to call up all the files relating to Galen in order to find the flaw the Death Star may have, a race for both sides to find what they need before the devastation starts.
Are we blind? Deploy the garrison!
This is the turning point for the rebellion now. The fact that they get caught off guard by rebel forces on their own home base alerts everyone, as in everyone from those like Tarkin on the Death Star to know where the base actually is that hid these plans, and the rebellion back home with those like Admiral Raddus ready to fight, showcasing to the people that once you start, you cannot stop what needs to be done. The bickering at the behest of the senators showed them nothing, but the actions that they are doing now shows them everything. Everything needed to fight an empire, which is their simple will. So thus, now you have the battle officially beginning with some familiar faces in the original film as the rebel fleet goes above the surface. This part is where things get to be more difficult, where they need to inform the fleet about the transmission of the plans, the point where the forces start getting killed as the hard parts are reached. I could spend more time analyzing this battle, but the main point here is how it's almost impossible for such plans to get within their reach. Because after all, the start of A New Hope has them being chased down because of those very plans. Every person connected from the end of Andor to that very movie is getting wiped off the map, as you see start with those like K2SO sadly, who cannot withstand an entire army and locks them off as Krennic gets notified of their breach, where sadly it puts off a chain reaction of all of them dying, with those like Melshi with his injuries and then Chirrut activating the switch, making the Death Troopers become Stormtroopers because of his trust in the Force before getting blown up himself, which they do manage to notify the fleet, planning to destroy the shield gate, but at the cost of it's a rapid sequence of events that shows you how fragile their lives are in war. The first of its kind in a big Star Wars film, where it knows what it was going to be in that one-off, but also showing the true cost of what really happens if you're not a Jedi or a smuggler. Because this isn't to say that this isn't harming the Empire at all. No. When in fact they actually suffered even more casualties than the rebels themselves, just not in comparison to a smaller alliance in a wider galaxy, but also being enough to inflict real change where Star Destroyers and Troopers are getting destroyed on a larger scale from a smaller force, the first that the Empire has even dealt with, all leading to this point of Jyn meeting with Krennic to face him down for what he has done to her family, his efforts being wasted despite what he believes in would turn out the other way, where they have an even larger chance of still failing, but still manage to see it through at the very last second. That rebellions are built on the slimmest margins within the distance of the looming Death Star, destroying the base with the hope that they didn't get the plans, not knowing that they actually did it, where this part represents the years of the fight that they put in their lives are now accomplished to something meaningful, that nothing Cassian did was in vain, and neither was Jyn for the legacy of her father, at least having others who would still carry that legacy and hope forward with what he would never reach on his own, but also with the irony of Krennic's fate being blasted by the weapon he sought to have control over, something that he regarded as his own, finally ending one man's tyranny from the higher-ups of their own making.
Your father would have been proud of you, Jyn.
And this speech hits harder, knowing the same thing would ring true for his own mother, or even Bix living peacefully with their child, where we now know that his sacrifice truly brought real change, that putting this all into context represents the true will of a hero, that they will fight until the very end if it means that they will win, even as we see how fragile that was with Vader coming in to destroy the rest of the rebel fleet and what happened in the hallway scene, which has now become one of the most iconic shots in all of Star Wars that has been replicated in so many ways, confirming this monstrous image of Darth Vader, and then the legacy with the lightful hope that his son brought, or even earlier with K2SO being a droid, where no matter what, it showed the power that this movie had on its own to confirm what was always believed in Star Wars, the raw strength of those like he had against everyone else who fought in this film, knowing it's part of a larger story, and that this individual one, no matter how pointless it could have seemed on the surface to explain events just before the first film they did, actually turned it around to do a great job in making you care. Like care about a girl who didn't even want to be in this fight but it eventually needed to, or being with somebody who fought for too long but also believed in it no matter what. The aspiration of hope that was the theme of this film as we realize that got transferred to Leia as they seek off to find that new hope while Vader prepares to track it down. Where no matter how small the effort could be, or dangerous as it should be, that if you could just win one battle, then you can win an entire war. Where you prove that the beast is defeatable and that there are people who can make the changes necessary to see it. The whole point of a movie like Rogue One was to show how you can win no matter how much can be lost, whether that be applied to these characters or the story of Star Wars overall, when you put into context setting in the chain of events that led to Anakin's redemption and Luke's rise for a saved galaxy against the Sith. It's about what someone's spirit has and the will to do what is right for the causes they believe in, and where wars are really won even before you get to the final victory, where having them live, even though that would have been preferable to their stories, would have not have made the same impact by their deaths that actually led to such a change. And if you're not sure about that, then you get the mess that divides people worse than they should be. The sad fate of the overall picture of Star Wars, where more people hate it than actually love it on the behest of just events that work the most over the story that actually drives it. We're almost 10 years on, it remains to be a fantastic piece that will be enjoyed for the years to come and showcase the blueprint of where those stories need to be. And that hopefully could be an effect that remains for good, as seen recently with Andor, where clearly this franchise is not dead, nor will it ever be if people don't want it to. And I'm all done. Goodbye.